So this work is with Kristine Brown, but given her shift to Amazon, we've had a little bit of addition to our project team, Catherine Edwards, who's also an economist at RAND, and Carolyn Rudder, who is a statistician. And I am really, really grateful to have the opportunity to present this at this conference. This is a paper that actually owes a lot to this conference, since I first got to talk to Kathleen Christensen about this project, standing right there. And then last year, Amal Harati presented some work that has really influenced the way we took this paper. So this is a great example, I hope a great example, of how much this conference can do. So the motivation for this paper, which is about how couples transition to retirement, comes from the fact that there are two very distinct literatures about retirement transitions. The first suggests that couples make transitions to retirement together, and they make these decisions together. And the second suggests that individuals have a desire to work after retirement or gradually retire. And there are potentially important interactions between these two literatures, but there hasn't been very much research that has tried to bring those two ideas together. And we think that in this paper, we're able to address that by thinking about how couples transition from working full-time to being retired in a joint process. One of the advantages of partial retirement is that it may give couples an opportunity to balance their individual labor force attachment with their preferences for joint leisure. So I like to tell a story about my parents to sort of motivate this paper because I think it makes it all really clear. My father was working. He got tired of working, seeing patients. He was a physician and decided he wanted to retire, but my mother didn't want to retire, so he went to part-time. And my mother continued working full-time, and my father was part-time, and that way he had something to do during the day while she went to work. But then he got tired of that too, so he transitioned to complete retirement, and he convinced my mom to go to part-time so that some of the time while he was sitting at home during the day, she'd be free to play with him. And finally, they have now both retired completely. But this idea that they could use partial retirement to have some concordance with what they were doing in their day is really a good example of what this paper is about. I should say the paper started before this whole process happened, but has been a good motivating story. So it gives this possibility to transition in a way that is more coordinated than you might be able to do if you have to go straight from working full-time to fully retired. So in this paper, what we are doing is trying to define and document the joint trajectories that couples take to retirement, and understand whether or not retirement trajectories of couples are concordant. That is, are they doing something similar at the same time? And then we're going to look at whether or not what characteristics are associated with different types of trajectories. There's another part of the project that's with Carolyn Rudder that looks at an econometric analysis based on multi-state models, but as you will see, that has proven to be a very difficult part of the project. So I think it's helpful to start with a picture to show you just how many possible states there are, and therefore how many possible trajectories there are. So you can imagine that we have the husband's labor force participation on this side, and the wife's labor force participation across the top. So they could be both at any point in time working full-time, working partially retired, or fully retired. And then there are 9 potential states of the world that a couple could be in, depending on what each of them is doing. If you think about these 9 states, it becomes very hard to start to think about what a trajectory from working full-time to being fully retired might look like. What you see is that there are many, many possible paths that could occur from this top corner to the bottom corner. Here's just an example of one to point out what I mean by the difference between retirement states and retirement trajectories. The state is where you are at any point in time, but the trajectory is the full path that you take from working full-time to being fully retired. And of course, there are many possible states. So in this paper, what we do is we select couples in which both spouses are observed working full-time in the HRS, and we follow them forward from that point in time as they transition out of joint full-time work. So we really are focusing only on those couples where we observe them both working full-time. And the reason is because we can't tell among other couples if the person who's not working full-time has already started their transition to retirement, or if they were never really attached to the labor force at all. So we'll follow people forward over the course of the HRS. At this point, we're using an hours-based definition of retirement, not anything based on individual stated definitions of retirement, because there are just simply too many categories if you were to include all of those different possibilities. And since we're already talking about 3 categories by 3 categories, since it's a joint retirement, it gets very complicated to use other kinds of definitions. So at this point, that's all we're doing. And we're observing people just every 2 years as they're observed in the HRS, not looking at dates of retirement in between the waves. So we start at the beginning of someone's trajectory, and we follow them forward until they either drop out of the sample or the sample ends, they die, or their marriage is dissolved. But otherwise, we're following the full trajectory within the HRS. So the first thing that we have found, which I think is really interesting and was sort of surprising to me, is that the initial transition to retirement typically is not concurrent between husbands and wives. We have this idea that people want to retire together, but in fact, we only find that about 15% of couples are both retiring at the same time. And in most cases, the husband is retiring first or the wife is retiring first. So here's where I have to thank Amal again for her work that she presented last year, because this allows us to look at what are the states that we observe over time for all of the people in our sample. So each color in here represents a different one of those states, and it stacks them up so that you can see what is the distribution of states over time across all of the waves. However, so there are 3 different types of states that we have in here. We have the concordant states, where both spouses are doing the same thing, both working full-time, both working part-time, or both fully retired. Discordant states, where one is working full-time and the other is fully retired. And what we'll call partially concordant states, where one is working full-time and one is working part-time and the other is either fully retired or working full-time. But if you want to see what the full trajectories look like in the data set, we have 2,773 people. And now what we've done is lined them up. So think of those as like a sheet of paper. Every line across that is an individual couple's retirement trajectory. And I show this only to show you how many different paths there are to retirement. In this sample, there are over 1,400 paths to retirement for only 2,773 couples. So there are many different ways that couples are going from working full-time to being fully retired. And it's not so simple as just retiring at the same time. So we have to come up with some strategy to try to manage that, to try to bring that down into some countable number of categories. So what we've done is 2 approaches to categorize trajectories. The first is a definition that we created on our own based on these ideas of concordance. And the second is a data-driven definition that uses a cluster analysis to determine what the different groups are in the data. And then we'll use multinomial logits to predict the different types of trajectories. And at the end, I'll very briefly discuss our attempts to use multi-state models to predict the full transitions across all of the trajectories. So here's our attempt to classify trajectories. We start with a group that is only observed working full-time. Those are pretty easy. We see some that work full-time during the entire time they're in the HRS. Then we have a group that is always concordant. That is, at any point in time when we observe them, both spouses are doing the same thing. It could be any of these different states, but they're always doing the same thing. And the third group, we say, is a group that is defined by ever being in this discordant state. So over the entire 10 or 11 trajectories states that we observe them in, at any point in time, one is working full-time and one is fully retired. And then those people could be observed in any other state during this time period, but like I said, at one point in time, they are completely discordant. And then the remaining group is observed in these states. There are some period of time when they are partially concordant. One is partially retired and the other is not partially retired. So only 6.6% of our sample is in a fully concordant path. In fact, most of them are in what we call a discordant path. Here I've removed the people that we just haven't observed anything about the retirement trajectories yet. And you can see that the vast majority, 60% of couples, have a discordant path, and only 30% are using some form of partial retirement during their retirement trajectories. So our conclusion from this is that the first transition is often made only by one person, and that these trajectories are not concordant. But this is based on our own best guess of how we should cluster the trajectories together. So the other strategy is to use the data to look for groups of sequences that are most similar. There's a distance function that is defined to identify the most similar sequences, and it clusters them together. And I am still learning about how this works, but it's, I think, been really a helpful way to try to figure out what the data looks like. What do these transitions look like over time? So when you use this analysis, you determine up front how many groups you want to have, and we tried a number of different things. We considered, I'm going to show you what happens if we have 3, 4, and 9, but I also did 5, 6, 7, and 8. But I didn't show that here because that would get pretty boring pretty fast. So here are what the trajectories look like if there are, or the states look like if there are 3 clusters. What you see is a group that spends a large proportion of their time both retired. So even though they're not transitioning to retirement necessarily simultaneously, their path to retirement is pretty quick, and they're quickly ending up in a situation where they're both retired. Then there is a group where what you observe is a number of different states, but they are associated with the woman working more than the man. And then a group where there are states where you observe a number of states where either both are working or the husband is working more than the wife. So here's this presented in the same 3x3 matrix that we had before, which I think helps to think about how big each of these clusters are. So again, just 17% are in this group that are going to full retirement relatively quickly. And many show up in this group where the wife is working more. But I'm a little hesitant to draw too much conclusion from that because, as you'll see in a couple of slides, there's something unusual going on there. So we tried 4 clusters, and when we do 4 clusters, what happens is that the first 2 remain the same, and the second, the one that was where the men are working more, splits out into 2 groups. One where the men are working more than the wives, and the other where they're both observed working for most of the periods. So you see here that just this top section has now broken into 2 separate clusters. And if we go all the way to 9 clusters, it now becomes almost impossible to read the pictures, but we can break it out into the same 3x3. And what you see here is that in these parts on this side of the table, they are larger than the ones here. What that means is that there are more states, more couples where the husband is more attached to the labor force, perhaps that's not surprising, observed longer in work than the wife. But there's this group in the middle, this remaining group, which is this ugly one up here, which relates to this one here. And as we keep creating more and more groups, that group gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I'm not convinced that we've actually gotten to the right number of trajectories, types of trajectories yet. I think that this may still have some different types of people who are clustered together in that group. The others are more similar. There's more of a block of the same color that you're observing, more people who are more similar in these groups. So again, suggestive evidence that joint retirement is relatively rare. But even with 9 clusters, there are still many who are in this group that has the remainders in it. 23% are still in that catch-all group that is doing a lot of very different things. So we also wanted to know who are the people who are following these different paths. Who are the kinds of couples, what are the kinds of couples, the characteristics of couples who are doing the same thing, retiring at the same time, or where the husband is working more than the wife. And so we've done some descriptive regressions using multinomial logits to look at which people are falling into each of these groups. So in the case of the groups that we created ourselves, here we're looking at whether they are partially concordant or discordant relative to the couples that have a more concordant path. And what you see is that the top one, these are relative risk ratios. So a number greater than 1 suggests that it is more likely than in the base group, and a number less than 1 suggests that it is less likely than in the base group. So when husbands are older, the couples are less likely to follow partially concordant or discordant paths. When husbands are older, couples are more likely to follow a more concordant path, and that is their age relative to others in our cohort. We also see that when husbands are older than their wives, when the age difference between them is larger and positive, that they are more likely to follow partially concordant or discordant paths. So when there's a bigger age difference, we see less concordance with what people are doing, and that is not surprising, perhaps. But what is surprising to me is that we see no effect of what happens when the wife is older. So there's no difference that is predicted by having a much older wife than husband, and perhaps that's just because that's not such a common category. We also see that when husbands are in good health and wives are in good health, then they're more likely to have a partially concordant path. This partial concordance also seems to be correlated with making less money. So when the husband has higher earnings, they are less likely to follow this partially concordant path. However, there are differences depending on how much earnings difference there is between the two in the couple. And partial concordance is becoming more and more common over time. That's the other thing that this result suggests. So the earliest cohorts in the HRS are less likely to have this kind of partial concordance, which is not surprising since partial retirement is also becoming more common over time, we think. So we did the same thing with the clusters that were predicted by the cluster analysis. And here I'm just going to focus on the 4 clusters, one where they both retire, both remain in the labor force. The husband remains in the labor force longer than the wife, and the wife remains in the labor force longer than the husband. I have these numbers here just so you can remember how big those groups are. The first cluster is much bigger than the others. But our base case here is the one where they both are retiring at the same time. And we, again, find that when husbands are older, they are less likely to be in these categories of working longer and more likely to be in the category that is retiring quickly, both jointly reaching retirement quickly. And similarly, when there's a bigger age difference, all of these categories are more common than the joint retirement. We have sort of similar findings. This is health. When husbands are in good health, they are more likely to both work longer. But when husbands are in good health, women are not as likely to work longer than their husbands. Perhaps it's, which somewhat surprised me, but this is health measured in the first wave, not health measured later on. So this isn't about health shocks that might occur. And we see similar results with regards to earnings for these clusters relative to both retiring at the same time and the other ones that I just showed you. And again, with the same kind of finding with the cohorts over time in our panel. I did the same regressions for 9 clusters, but I'm not going to show you those because then we have 8 sets of coefficients, and that's even harder to take in. But the results are largely the same, except for the fact that that largest catch-all cluster seems to perhaps be associated with poor health for husbands, perhaps when husbands are in poor health, the paths are more unpredictable. So overall, what we're finding by examining the entire trajectory, we see that joint retirement is less common than we might have guessed. We don't necessarily observe people retiring at the same time. Rather, they're following discordant paths where one is working full-time and the other is retiring. And we see that people follow, and couples follow many, many different paths to retirement. The data-driven models suggest that trajectories where the husband is working longer than the wife are more common than the wife working longer than the husband. And joint retirement is more common among couples with older husbands relative to other couples, larger positive age differences, that is where husbands are more older than their wives relative to other couples. And I also want to point out, and then I'll talk about the multi-state models quickly, we thought that urban and rural categorizations might be helping to predict what would happen here, because we thought that partial retirement might be easier in urban labor markets where there are more job opportunities available, but we didn't find any evidence of that. So the last thing that we're still working on, and the statisticians on my team are actively working on, even as we speak, is trying to develop a multi-state model. And I think that this is a really promising way to think about the transitions to retirement, but it's very, very difficult. These models are similar to hazard models in that they allow you to think about the transition from one state to the next, but they allow you to think about transitions between many, many states over time. In this case, 6 or 9 states. And you can estimate the probability of transitioning from any state to any other state over time. But with 6 or 9 distinct states, there are 30 to 72 separate regression models that need to be estimated, because there are 72 possible transitions. You can transition from full-time to fully retired, or you can transition back. And all of the other transitions within that matrix are possible. And so as we have tried to add covariates to the model, and by adding covariates, I mean adding even a single covariate to the models completely break down and we aren't able to estimate anything. So we're trying to think about ways that we can simplify the models, make some assumptions about what might be possible transitions and what are less possible transitions that we don't need to estimate. But at this point in time, sadly, this strategy is not working very well for us. So, thank you.
Thank you, John, for having me. I'm going to be talking Linda Morrill from North Carolina State. This is a really interesting paper, a really interesting project, and I think the real innovation is, as I think Catherine pointed out nicely, combining these two lines of literature, thinking first about these alternative pathways to retirement. They're often complex. They involve phased retirement and bridge jobs and unretirements and that sort of thing. And then combining this with joint retirement considerations. So what this paper does, the main contribution, is to try and address both of these issues by modeling the complex pathways in a dual earner household context. So I think there are 3 main contributions to this work. The first is just to characterize the way that couples are transitioning from work to retirement. So making the point pretty strongly that this individual-only framework is not going to be capturing a lot of the important aspects of retirement decision-making, and that the decisions that dual earner couples face are much more complicated than just should I retire or not. There's a lot of different types of choices that the workers could be making. Second, the data that they're using, the HRS, allows the authors to really include a lot of interesting sources of variation. So in the paper, there's a lot of areas that they're thinking about looking at, including type of occupation and the availability of part-time work. So I think that is a real advantage to the approach. And then, of course, this multi-state modeling of pathways was just a pretty unique way, I think, to address these issues. So what they find is that most retirement transitions are going to involve some sort of discordance, that people are not synchronizing their retirements together perfectly. And this is my very simplified analysis, but mostly couples are not both fully retiring quickly. They're either one is leading the wife or the husband. And then these multinomial logit regressions of discordance in the retirement pathways show some interesting heterogeneity. And so I think maybe some interesting extensions or ways to take some of the early empirical results here is to really think a little bit more about the husband's age effects and to try and understand how much of this is truly age when you're observed in the HRS versus a cohort effect. And I'll come back to this at the end. I think there's a lot of changes over the birth cohorts that are covered in the HRS in what it means for a woman to be employed. And so I think there may be some interesting variation that we could look at. I also would suggest when you do start thinking about occupation to really pay particular attention to teachers or other public sector workers. A lot of women in the early cohorts of the HRS would have been teachers, and their retirement paths we know are quite different. They're going to be retiring at much younger ages, and so part of that fully retired group that is kind of hard to capture could be because you're combining some of these women in there who are very much attached to the labor market, but also are going to retire much younger. And I also kept coming back to this notion of what should I be most interested in here? Is it the timing, like when is the couple themselves going from working to retiring? Is that happening quickly or is that happening later versus the sequencing? Like who is going to be leading the retirement phase? Is it the wife that really wants to stay a little bit longer in the workforce because she didn't have as many working years? Or is it the husband who's potentially older? And so how is it really the sequencing that makes that question important? So I just want to sort of close on a few thoughts that I had as I was reading through about why I think this project and this line of research is really important to study. And the first, I think, is very well motivated in the paper, which is to just understand, if we want to understand how people are responding to different policies, or financial incentives that they're faced with, we need to make sure that we're accounting for the couple's full situation. So if we want to have a sense of what couples are doing, then we need to be modeling them at a household level. I also became interested in the notion of whether or not we can have a better sense of retirement income security from thinking about retirements in a joint setting. So partners can insure against certain shocks if there's earning capacity in both couples. And I wondered if the couples that were both deciding to retire earlier so that they could have joint leisure, if they were going to find themselves in a riskier financial situation, if they both have a long period of time in retirement versus those that are kind of hedging and maybe one is transitioning partially to retirement but could always end up working in a little bit more, or if there are ways that that synchronization could affect their overall retirement income security. Also, I thought it was interesting to think about whether or not these dual earner couples that you have in your data are needing to perhaps have higher replacement rates if they're planning to enjoy some joint leisure activities relative to a setting where only one of them is retiring, and so maybe the pension income is less important. The third area that I think is sort of interesting in this context is how retirement is related to the health and well-being of retirees. And so if we want to understand whether or not it's good for an individual to retire, I think it's important to think about what the spouse is doing, whether or not an individual is retiring on their own or enjoying that leisure time with their spouse. And then sort of finally, I'll just close on thinking about what this line of research can tell us or how it's related to female labor force participation rates generally. So over the course of the cohorts that are covered by the HRS, females' labor force participation really grew tremendously. And so I wonder, as I was reading this paper, whether women are retiring totally differently than men, and can we find evidence of that? And then whether or not having a working wife changes the way that men retire. And so we have a lot of models that try and help us to understand what the retirement process is that were developed off of men who had long careers. Are they appropriate for women? And also, are they appropriate for men who are married to working women? And I think we saw a lot of evidence, or early evidence here, that suggests that couples are influencing the retirement path of their spouse. And so perhaps we need to think a little bit about whether or not having a partner changes a man's own decision. And so I'll just end with my request for the next paper that this team works on, which should be not to restrict our attention to dual earner couples and see what they're doing, but rather to look at men and see whether or not their retirement transitions differ if they have a working spouse, and what characteristics of the couples would influence whether men, and I sort of put this in quotes, deviate from what they would have done if they didn't have to take into account what their spouse was doing. And so that would provide some evidence, at least, on whether or not we need to start thinking about a new style of retirement that's coming about because of these joint retirement decisions.
We have time for some questions. Let me make one comment myself, if I could, namely that with these pathways to retirement, or one retirement followed, these various pathways, it might be interesting to look at the Social Security claiming strategies. For instance, you could imagine that one person retires, the other keeps working, and they keep working to allow that first retiree to defer claiming. Now, my guess is that's not going on, but it could happen. And maybe it even should happen, but it probably doesn't. But I think looking at how the claiming happens with along these various pathways might be interesting. Yeah.
Hi to you for the video. Hi. I was wondering if you had looked at, or if you could look at, the presence of children still in the household, because there's some sociology literature that suggests that once kids have gone off to college or have left the house, that may affect retirement behavior. And then the second thing would be, of course, grandchildren, and that's just based on anecdotal data, because my mother-in-law's retirement patterns were 100% caused by how many grandchildren she had and how much they needed her and so on. And I think the reason that my father-in-law soon followed her into retirement also deals with the fact that 6 grandkids are fun. So.
Are there other questions or comments? Yeah.
So, sitting at this table right now, we have Nicole and we have Courtney, and we, Tom Steinmeier and I, all did joint retirement models that are structural of one variety or another. And we've estimated utility functions, we've looked at the Social Security answers, we've looked at the interdependence between the husbands and wives. So my question is, what else does this buy you that you don't get out of doing a full-blown interdependent structural retirement model? Where is this supposed to take us now?
Can I respond to that? Because I've thought about a lot that one. I think I don't need it. I've thought about that question a lot, and I think that the structural models are really important for understanding the transitions that people are making, but they don't give us a picture of what is the incidence of these different types of models in the population, of these different types of transitions that people are making in the population. And it's, I think, still valuable to understand how the trends are changing over time. So knowing that older cohorts are younger cohorts are behaving differently than older cohorts, these descriptive patterns are still, I think, are valuable. And then there were a couple of other comments. I think that the question about retirement security is also really interesting. In some other work that we're doing, we're looking at joint retirement savings decisions of couples, and it seems like that's actually a case where we don't see very much evidence of discussion. So that's I think something that we need to try to bring the two pieces together. And John and Joanna, both good comments, and something we'll definitely look into.
So to your point about incidence and the descriptive trends, I think from some of these past papers, I have the sense that what others have found is that the incidence of joint retirement is more on the order of 1/3, whereas you're talking about it being sort of 15%. So that difference made me want to dig in a little deeper and understand why things look different. One thing could just be that you're following people over longer time, so you're observing more completed transitions, and there was some censoring in papers where people use the HRS at a much earlier point. Another possibility is that as we're getting new cohorts into the HRS, behavior itself may be changing over time. Another possibility is that you're introducing this idea of partial retirement as being an important piece of the picture, and other people overlook that by just defining, just having two states of work versus retirement. And I think another possibility that's worth at least exploring a little bit is the difference between defining things in terms of what's happening at the waves versus the amount of time that's elapsing. Because I think a lot of people have maybe defined retirement together as retiring like within a year of each other. And it sounds very startling to say, oh, this is a discordant pattern because we observed them at the wave and they weren't doing the same thing. But it's possible that someone else might have coded that as retired together if like within a year those people did the same thing. So I think, and it was just, happened to be that you caught them where one had, the other one was going to retire 2 months later or something. So I think it would be worth at least digging a little bit into the dates of retirement, even though I understand your analysis is mostly wave-based, but to understand just across all those different possibilities, which one is most important for explaining why your descriptive results are different.
And those are good ideas.
I see a question. Joe?
Yep. So on this point about joint retirement being less common than we thought, the way I think about jointness in retirement is really more that the trajectories are correlated, not necessarily that they're doing the exact same thing at the same time. So I think what you're kind of bringing with this careful attention to detail in categorizing the trajectories over time is kind of bringing in these intermediate states where one might be working, one is partially retired, or one is out, and the other one is in, at least in part. And so I guess kind of revisiting that idea, it's not really that they do it at exactly the same time, it's just that it's correlated. And then I guess my next question to you would be, well, is it better to be discordant or concordant? And you might be able to look at that from from a variety of different perspectives. So what about the retirement security of the couple, the welfare of the couple, taking account their preferences, and then individual welfare. And so in some other work looking at the return to work for married women versus married men, when they hit the same ages, the return to work for women is actually quite a bit higher than it is for men. And a lot of this has to do with them being at different parts of the age earnings profile at the time retirement tends to arrive for the husband.
Thank you. With so many possible transitions for each one of the two, and then basically squaring it because you have two folks in a couple. You mentioned that in some of your current empirical work, you're trying to combine some of these characteristics for these outcomes for computational reasons. And I'm wondering, other than ease of calculation of stuff, are there other reasons to reduce the number of options? I just sort of fear the danger of sensory overload. There's so many different things that you're trying to explain. Is it possible that you end up learning less than you would if you had a smaller number of categories, even though within a given category there are things that aren't exactly the same?
I think that's a good point, and that's why we've done the regression analysis with the 4 clusters and the 9 clusters, because I do think that it's important to think about whether or not we are losing, we're not able to see something because we just end up having too many. I think that's a good point. And I should say that when we're looking at these clusters as they're calculated based on similarity in the data, I think that does allow for more of this concept of correlation rather than perfect concordance, because one wave where they're observed in a different state, but then the rest of the trajectory looks more similar, ends up getting picked up in that same cluster, basically. So thank you again, Amal.
Well, I'll just add like 2 kind of nerdy technical cluster analysis points. One was to the earlier question. I think one of the advantages of cluster analysis is that in some ways the algorithm will tell you whether 9 or 4 is nicer. And so there's something to be said for sort of simplifying before one sort of gets into the analytics, but in a lot of ways, the whole sort of point of cluster analysis is it'll kind of do that for you. To the extent that there are sort of emergent patterns, those will sort of come to surface, so to speak, regardless of kind of how you set it out in the first place, which I think was shown nicely, Kate, when you kind of looked at the 4 and the 9 clusters. It ends up being that you sort of split out the miscellaneous group into further and further detail. That just the one thing I might suggest is there is a technique called multi-channel sequence analysis, and what you could do there is essentially create dyads, and so you can stack the husband and wife's sequences together, and then essentially create, sort of do the same kind of thing, but in these dyad pairs, and that will allow you to look not so much at the concordance, but at the sequencing within dyad, and that might be a good way to try to get to some of the questions that were asked.